Sold out, and sold out. But we should still talk about the 5070 Ti. Welcome to Machines and More. Crazy times in the GPU market reminds me of almost 5 years ago when the 30 series cards launched during the pandemic, and that makes it complicated to analyze this series, but I'll do my best here. The card that we are looking at today is Asus's TUF Gaming 5070 Ti. This is the OC edition, so it is not a so-called MSRP model. Apologies, I had every intention to do this review on the launch date, but shipping delays meant that I didn't end up getting this review unit until after the launch. So at this point, it is sold out as many expected, and I do hope and expect there to be more. So my intent here, hopefully you can reference this as a guide to determine whether or not to keep this card on your watch list or go ahead and wait and see. Good news is if you are card shopping and you came up short for 5070 Ti, that's actually not a bad idea to wait, since there are plenty of mid-range cards coming. In fact, this is the first so-called mid-range card for the new generations from Nvidia and AMD to have launched at this point. So the analysis will be more pertinent after we can talk about the 5070, the 9070, and 9070 XT. So I am planning to do a mid-range discussion after those launch, and I've reviewed those cards. That being said, I don't want to delay this just for that, given this could restock at any moment. So real quick, this card is a review unit supplied by Asus. Big thanks to them. However, as with all reviews here on the channel, they're not paid for by the company. The testing is done completely independently with my review methodology. My review philosophy is to be fair and objective here. And if you enjoy that type of content, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Quick overview, 5070 Ti is partner only. So Nvidia does not have a competing Founders Edition model, unlike with 5080 and 5090. The reference pricing that they set is $750 US. So Asus's TUF Gaming 5070 Ti OC is a higher end model in their stack. In fact, at launch, it's going to be the highest end one that they're offering. Beneath it, they do have their Prime Series cards. One is the OC model at roughly $940 US, and a vanilla non-OC one at Nvidia's reference price of $750. So I did want to note up front, I know this is a big pain point for a lot of us. With the GPU market the way it is, it's very difficult to give you a price-based recommendation. So on one hand, yes, this card does have an MSRP of roughly $1,000 US, and I actually checked to make sure retailers like Micro Center, Newegg are in fact selling this for that much. And so you as a customer, you can go out and buy one for that price as long as there is stock. So if anything, it's the base MSRP models that I have some pricing questions about. So in theory, they do exist and they will continue to exist, and you can theoretically get them. But how many are actually available is the question mark. So I don't know what the mix is like. I'm not going to get into the speculation game. But my impression and my educated survey so far from looking at the market is that the price for 5070 Ti's appears to really start north of $900. So this is looking at offerings from Asus, MSI, and Gigabyte to give a generalized idea. The other factor that makes reviewing complicated is that 50 series and 40 series both use TSMC's 4N process. Silicon-wise, they are similar manufacturing processes, so Nvidia has transitioned to making 50 series instead of 40 series. So if you're hoping to get a 40 series card on the cheap, with the new generation coming in, the supply is dwindling there. Card pricing has gone up, and overall it's just a really bad situation pricing wise, not just for 50 series cards. In this review, I'll be making comparisons to 40 series, but I can't tell you, hey, go get one or don't get one, because the prices are kind of all over the place with that. So even if there is stock, and don't even get me started on the secondary market. So if you're in the market to upgrade, I feel your pain. It's just like the 30 series saga, and it really sucks to see that again. So all that is to say, I understand the question mark with pricing. So in the interest of moving forward, let's proceed with the assumption that this is in fact a $1,000 US card, and you can go ahead and decide if it is worth it based on the features that you see here. The 5070 Ti is Nvidia's mid-high Blackwell GPU, 8960 CUDA cores with 16 gigs of GDDR7 VRAM on a 256-bit bus. For reference, board power is 300 watts, and it'll sit between the higher 5080 and lower 5070, which is yet to be launched, which have 10752 and 6144 CUDA cores respectively. 5080 will have a little bit more memory bandwidth, but the same amount of VRAM. 5070, which is not released, will have only 12 gigs on a 192-bit interface. So I did check this card specifically. It does show 96 RPs, so no shortage there, which is good. Asus's TUF implementation here, the core clock spec in the OC mode is 2610 MHz, which is going to be higher than the reference spec of 2452 MHz boost. Again, noting there is no Founders Edition card in the 5070 Ti. In use, this card did actually boost to 2820 MHz out of the box without doing any tuning. So you could also do the tuning yourself with a more basic model card. So whether or not the increment here over a non-OC model is worth it, that's debatable, as some may just prefer to take it out of the box and go, and that's worth something too, right? What is tangibly different is that the TUF OC has a big beefy cooler, 329mm long by 140mm wide by 62.5mm thick. There's a 3-slot plus like 3.1 slot thick card with a 2-slot hanger. The value added over their Prime series is a beefier cooler versus the 2.5 slot design for the Prime card. So I will say the Prime is a lot more SFF friendly, and I did test this guy in an M2 here, but the side panel actually won't close on this one due to the power connector. So there is that consideration for those of you with this case. Of course, the AC168, if and when that happens, perfect card for that case. The heatsink has 12 heat pipes with a vapor chamber. Vapor chamber is something that they are adding to both the Prime series and TUF, even for the mid-range cards, and that can help with transient performance or rapidly changing power draw, which is actually quite common in titles like Cyberpunk. And another thing that they are adding to their cards is a phase change thermal pad, and this will yield better thermal consistency, and you don't have to worry about repasting or thermal paste going bad over time. The card does have an aluminum backplate. The backplate isn't actually indented. It's completely an optical illusion, and still kind of looks like the TUF line that you may have seen in the past. And there are actually thermal pads under there, underneath the backplate, which you don't always see with AIB cards. 3 dual ball bearing fans. Center one spins in an opposite direction versus the other 2. And you'll notice that one of the fans covers a flow-through section of the card. So where you will get the most airflow, meaning the PCB doesn't cover that part, that is actually very helpful for overall card cooling. Cards have a performance versus quiet switch, a P and Q switch, and that mainly governs the fan behavior. So in side-by-side testing with Cyberpunk, P mode fans ran at about 1300 RPM versus 1000 RPM on the Q mode. The power behavior is similar, and but that end result with the difference in thermals, 4 degrees cooler, GPU did clock in about 14 megahertz faster because of that. So any performance difference because of that P and Q switch should be negligible. If you do want to get some noise optimization in your case or ambient environment isn't too hot, the Q mode isn't a bad idea. It's not going to give up too much performance. Overall, these are great temps with this cooler. Here with the 265 watt load in Cyberpunk, the temps are going to be very manageable. Cooling is definitely not a concern here, as long as you can provide a proper exit path for the exhaust. The card does exhaust out the sides. Let's take a quick listen to the fans. I did want to give you a sample at what I observed to be the more common gaming RPMs that I mentioned, and I will just increase a little bit just for, give you an idea of what it might sound like in a varying ambient environment. Speaking volume here, just to give you an idea of what the ambient sound is like for a reference point. Right now the GPU fans are at 940 RPM, which is a little bit lower than you might hear even in the quiet mode under a gaming scenario. I've ramped up speeds to roughly 1050 RPM here for all the fans. 1150 RPM, about where you might see it settle in under kind of the higher quiet mode operation. This level is where I saw the fans reach at equilibrium for gaming under the P mode. This is roughly 1,300 RPM. Fans are now at 1,420 RPM. And now we're at 1,560 RPM. So a little bit elevated. If you are in a warmer room, you may see the fans hit this level. And now you're really starting to hear the fans at 1,720 RPM. I don't expect the fans to hit this level in regular use unless you have a very warm room. The backplate and cooler structure does contribute to stiffening the card ensemble. It is a very heavy card after all. And in the event that you are looking for a little bit more support, Asus includes a foot to prop the card up. It wouldn't really help in an inverted scenario like this unless you had a, like a stick. But the card is quite stiff to begin with. So generally speaking, I haven't noticed bending, and the cooler design seems fairly sufficient. Shroud does have a little bit of RGB lighting right in the corner here with the TUF logo and a few dots around it. And you can control that in Aura Sync or just go ahead and turn it off if you'd like. With all of this cooler that you see here, the TUF OC does have an increased TBP of 330 watts, which is 10% higher than Nvidia's spec. So in practice, it still doesn't get anywhere close to that during gaming. But I'll cover that shortly when we talk about performance. The power delivery is via 16-pin connector. It is slightly recessed, so it doesn't stick out as much as it could. Although, as you can see here, this right angle connector is still quite proud of the cooler. So do plan on needing additional width clearance for that 16-pin connector. And if that connector isn't properly connected, a red LED will illuminate to give you a visual warning to, make sure you seat that properly. So based on Asus's marketing material, their components are military grade, and that is specifically the chokes and MOSFETs. Only time will tell, but with higher grade components should come higher durability. So sample of one though, this particular card did have some coil inductor resonance, or so-called coil whine. Now, it's not terrible, and to be frank, I have heard very few cards without it since the 30 series, FE, AIB, all of them. Now, this one wasn't particularly egregious, but this is something just to be aware of, so this could happen on the card you get. On the concept of durability, they do have a PCB coating that's applied. As I am told, it's mainly for anti-dust or debris, although in a more humid environment, that could help for moisture resistance as well. So overall, given that this occupies a premium position versus your more basic offerings, the main thing you are getting here is a well-designed cooler with more cooling capability, some aesthetic features, and an elevated out-of-box GPU boost target for additional overclocking on top of how much it's clocked out of the box. Let's get into some benchmarks, shall we? On the test system here, this is the NCase M2, Asus's X870 ITX board, 9800X3D at stock settings, and the main comparison here that I will be talking about is against the base 4080 Super, because as you will see, it's a very close performer to that card. And apologies, I would have liked to get the 5080 into the mix here, but I am still waiting on a review unit. The meat and potatoes of our benchmarks here are gaming. And this is going to be a gaming target market for the 5070 Ti after all. And I am testing at 1440p at highest settings where applicable, except for Black Myth. 1080 will often introduce a CPU limitation that really wouldn't be value added for your comparison here. So I think you'll see that this card is most suited to moderately high FPS 1440p gaming at high quality settings, or you can do 4K at moderate settings as well. So let's go ahead and start with Cyberpunk. With DLSS off and RT off, the 5070 Ti here is quite good. In fact, it surprised me as it beats out the 4080 Super FE. Throw in RT at very high settings and the game basically becomes unplayable. though for the sake of comparison, it's still very competitive versus the 4080 Super. And this is a situation where you will, if you want RT, you will need DLSS with frame generation to get a higher FPS result. At least for this title, the 5070 Ti beats out the 4070 Ti Super by a generous margin, and these two are actually similar TUF series cards that I'm comparing. MSFS 2020, 5070 Ti trails the 4080 Super here, but does outperform the 4070 Ti Super by roughly 7%. Red Dead 2, 5070 Ti trails the 4080 Super by about 6 to 7% and beats out the 70 Ti Super by a little bit over 7% margin. Enabling DLSS does give you a bit of a bump here, but these are pretty good frame rates already. Black Myth Wukong, very demanding title at very high settings with only DLAA enabled and no ray tracing. The 5070 Ti does beat the 4080 Super. With RT on, it does trail by a tiny bit. For RT on situations, the frame gen is extremely helpful. So these are really just expanding off of what the results are in a non-frame gen situation. So you can see that similar positioning here. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is another title. The 5070 Ti TUF OC beat out the 4080 Super FE. Assassin's Creed Mirage. 4080 Super is a little bit better. And same story for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So just to throw in something a little bit different in a traditional rasterization scenario, it's a title near and dear to me. AoE 4, Asus's 5070 Ti does exceed the 4080 Super again. So overall for gaming, the TUF OC 5070 Ti pretty much matches the 4080 Super FE in a pure rasterization scenario. The 4080 Super does have a little bit better frame time consistency versus a similar to your 4070 Ti Super. The difference is close to 10%. If we swap out the RT results for the title, I tested it with the 4080 Super does now beat it by a smidge. But for all intents and purposes with respect to gaming, I do not think you'll see too much of a difference between a vanilla 4080 Super and the 5070 Ti TUF here, the OC model. However, there's a difference in the arena of power. As an example, Cyberpunk for 1440p, the 5070 Ti did tend to draw down around 265 watts with a 440 watt total system power versus the 4080 Super, which in an equivalent scene drew down with a total system power draw of closer to 465 watts. Comparing in some synthetic benchmarks seem to illustrate a similar story. So for Uniden superposition and 4K optimized, 4070 Ti TUF scores a bit higher than the 4080 Super FE, and it's just a tad behind in Times by Extreme, and it scores exceedingly well in the Port Royal benchmark. For workstation performance, I did a quick test here. The 4080 Super will still have an advantage by about 10% in the Blender benchmark. I don't have a base spec 5070 Ti on hand to do exact comparisons, but I did confirm with Asus that just based on the spec alone, the Prime is spec to clock in at about 130 megahertz lower than the TUF OC here. So just experimenting by manually dropping the clocks by that much, I only saw about a 3% decrease in average FPS for Cyberpunk and 2% in averages for Assassin's Creed Mirage. So back of the envelope, I'd expect the increment, at least just straight out of the box, for the TUF Gaming OC over a vanilla Prime to be a small but measurable difference in the single-digit percentages. So a big cooler like this will give you overhead for overclocking, even though it is already overclocked out of the box. I did use Asus's GPU Tweak 3 to further overclock and test it out. There is still quite a bit of room for that. You can increase the power up to the 330 watt TBP limit. And with all the sliders maxed out for both core and memory clocks, there's a decent bump up. Now at this setting, it's going to draw down approximately 30 watts more power, and your core clocks do end up coming in north of 3000 megahertz though. So it's pretty good. This yields about a 9% bump in superposition and a 7.8% bump in Times by Extreme. How it ultimately translates to games will depend on the title. So for example, in Assassin's Creed Mirage, I did see close to a 9% bump in averages, whereas in Cyberpunk, only about a 3% bump. So, your mileage may vary. Did keep fan speeds the same just to show the absolute thermal impact from the increased power. The temps bump up to be expected with the additional power. These aren't actually still not bad temps. In fact, these could be considered decent stock temps for a lot of cards. So for the performance to be where it is in an OC scenario, the TUF cooler here is doing a very good job. So value recommendation, as I mentioned, let's proceed with the assumption that this is a $1,000 mid-range card. Not too recently, you could get a high-end 4080 Super FE for $1,000. The market pricing for 5080 seems to have started around $1,200. With the TUF version of the 5080 that comes in at a whopping $1,485 US. So in that context, I wouldn't say the TUF OC 5070 Ti is entirely unreasonable. When the TUF OC 4070 Ti came out, it was $850, and the 4070 Ti Super TUF was $800 or so. I think in that same breath, it's not great either, because gen over gen, we should see some decent savings, right? We are still talking the same process. There's only so much improvement we can expect, but you know, either way, the pricing scenario, it is what it is. So versus what you are seeing on the market, because we have to say, well, what's our best alternative? Based on my research, the 70 Ti's will start around $900. So if you find yourself in a situation where you can get a base MSRP 5070 Ti, by all means, that's a complete no-brainer. Definitely do that, right? There's kind of, if you can get that, if you like that and you see it, do it. Unfortunately, the more plausible real-world scenario you have to evaluate is if the bigger TUF gaming cooler, which can be a liability in smaller cases, and some of those less visible add-ons like backplate thermal pads, plus out-of-the-box OC, higher power limit for your own OC, is that all worth the additional $100, which works out to be an incremental 5% out of a 2K total system that I would estimate for 5070 Ti's. As mentioned, I would expect the difference against the non-OC Prime to be low single digits, and against the Prime OC, I'd expect out of the box, it'll be hard to notice a difference. I will say that if I found myself in some kind of dream world situation where both the Prime OC and the $1,000 TUF OC, they're both on the shelf and I had to reach for one, I would go for the Prime. But that's purely because I want the thinner card to begin with, because I work with smaller cases, and that's a decent amount of beer too. So that being said, this cooler is very impressive. So if you do have the space and you value quiet operation, or you value doing additional overclocking, the TUF OC has a lot of potential, and you are getting something in it. It's a high quality card. And if these mid-range prices make you wince, then my recommendation is to wait, because even if it takes a few months, even a year, the additional models and information that will come out shortly will make for a more informed and more elegant decision process. So, you know, stay tuned. So I hope you found this helpful and informative. As always, if that was helpful, please give a like. Make sure you are subscribed as well. There's a ton more GPU content coming up. Links are down below. Big thanks for watching.